Recording in progress. Well, great to have you with us, and really great to have Stephen and Deepak with us. Before we get to Stephen and Deepak, and they will introduce themselves in a moment, and we can have a conversation for 20-25 minutes or so. Just an introduction to this webinar series, telling you a bit about where we're coming from, why we're doing this, and so on, and some news of some stuff that's upcoming. So what if we put agreement on outcomes before solutions? That's one of three questions in this rolling series of webinars. Now, this month, we've got special guests, Stephen Dowling and Deepak Ganga. They're dialing in from Australia. Their colleague Scott Patterson might also dial in, but he's traveling to from around Malaysia at the moment, so he may or may not be able to join us. But just to introduce the series, the rolling series of three webinars, there are three questions we like to ask, and they're questions you can ask too. Whatever your scope, whatever your scale, whether you're working at team level, team of teams, whole organization, whether you're a leader of any kind in an organization, or even just a team member, or someone external, a coach, a consultant, whatever. These are three questions you can ask that will help your organizations do a better job of developing and pursuing strategy. Developing and pursuing strategy in the language of needs, obstacles, and outcomes. So the first question, and that's today's question: what if we put agreement on outcomes before solutions? And in our conversation with Stephen and Deepak, we'll actually be modeling some of that in our conversation. What if we put agreement on outcomes before solutions? That's our big what if. This is the big question that's got us going since 2016 or so, quite a number of years now, led to agenda shift, and now leading with outcomes. Next one, how do we keep bringing outcomes to the foreground? So that'll be the topic of next month's webinar. How do we keep outcomes in the foreground as we are finding and testing good solutions, pursuing what it is we want to pursue? And thirdly, and this will be the topic for May, and I hope to have a special guest for the May one. I won't reveal the name yet, but a special guest for May. Where and where else could we be developing and pursuing strategy? And the reason why it's where and where else is because this is fractal engagement. This is engaging with your organization in all of its complexity, all of its potential, all of its wonderful complexity, all its wonderful potential, because it's people relating to each other. So those three questions have driven us now. Excuse me, I had COVID last week, which is why I sound a bit bunged up. Three questions have driven us now all those years. And that has led to, first of all, agenda shift. So agenda shift is an engagement model. It's mainly of interest to practitioners. How do you engage with organizations and help them develop and pursue strategy in the language of needs, obstacles, and outcomes? Leading with outcomes, that's been going for the last 3 years or so. That is agenda shift, but as leadership development. How do we help leaders at all levels in organizations ask these three questions? What are the tools that they can use to ask them more effectively? How can they help their organizations develop and pursue strategy in the language of needs, obstacles, and outcomes? Again, wholehearted, you may hear from time to time. That's actually our mission. Our mission is wholehearted organizations. And that's not a particular organization design. That's not a framework. Nothing, it's not a process framework like Scrum or SAFe or something. All we're wanting to be happening in our organizations is that leaders at every level are owning the challenges, the imbalances, the contradictions in their scopes. They're engaging on them, inviting other people to engage them, and that way help to better integrate the work that they are doing and the strategies that they are pursuing. And lastly, adaptive organization. That is more technical. So there we get into the deep magic of organization and of organizing and some of the important models that drive that. We're thinking about viable system model, for example, from the systems world. We're thinking about complexity. We're thinking about developmental organizations. We're thinking about models of leadership, trust building leadership in particular. So we have built Leading with Outcomes, that our leadership development curriculum around those ideas, around those questions. Foundation, inside out strategy, outside in strategy, and adaptive organization. And as you may have seen from announcements yesterday on the mailing list and on LinkedIn and on Slack and so on, we're now in beta 2 of adaptive organization. In terms of the self-paced version of that, the introduction and chapter 1 went live on the Agenda Shift Academy yesterday. So quite an exciting day for us yesterday. And there was also a program for trainers and facilitators as well. You can teach this stuff. You can use the tools via the program. So that's the background to Agenda Shift and Leading with Outcomes. In terms of the calendar, I'm speaking at a meetup tomorrow between spaces, scopes, and scales, what the scaling frameworks don't tell you. That deep magic of organization that I told you about, let's apply that to those challenges of scale. Next, Leading with Outcomes Foundation is going to be taught by Carl Scotland at Agile India. So that's March. For April, the next webinar is on the 4th. Don't miss the next webinar. How do we keep bringing outcomes to the foreground as we're finding solutions? We're putting outcomes before solutions. That's the secret to all of this. And the other thing I was announcing yesterday, I've had some capacity free up in April. And I am super keen for opportunities to test adaptive organization in person during April, if that's possible. Preference to the UK, and if not the UK, then easily reachable from the UK. You know, if you're a short plane ride from Manchester Airport, then I'm up for it. May, the next webinar. Now, the reason I haven't given a date to the May webinar is because we're lining up a special guest. So we're just working out a date that's going to work. But that is where and where else should we be developing and pursuing strategy. Doing there is just shorthand for developing and pursuing. The next trainer facilitator, TTTF, is also in late May. And then June, an online foundation, and then 3 days in June in London. Foundation and 2 days of adaptive organization. And you can choose 1 day or 2 consecutive days, or take all 3 days. So that was announced yesterday as well. Information about all of those you'll receive in an email at some point today. How to subscribe, how to find out about these events, how to join these events, and so on. But that's enough from me. That was the commercial break right at the very beginning. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and And let's talk to Stephen and Deepak. Well, thank you for sitting through those few slides there. So Stephen and Deepak, so introduce yourselves. Where are you coming from, both physically, metaphorically? What kind of organizations are you working for? Let's start with Stephen. So now Stephen and I, we've known each other for a few years, but Stephen, introduce yourself to everyone here.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mike. I'm delighted to be here with everybody. You can probably tell from my accent, I'm an Irishman. I live in Melbourne. I'm a very simple Irishman. Just ask my wife and my kids. I think deep down, I'm an educator, and a lot of what I do, my company ETM, is all about teaching education. And my big passion is connecting the dots, trying to make sense out of things. I think I have a fairly interesting sort of diverse background. I started life as a management accountant working in industry, and then I was looking for a bit more excitement, and I was working for a small office of Thomson Reuters in Dublin, and I got involved in, they were putting in a new general ledger, and there was new systems that were happening, and I took on the kind of project leadership role of that. And I said, oh, wow, this is a lot more interesting than my day job. And then I got into managing big transformational kind of projects, like, ERP types, big system wise, SAP and JD Edwards type stuff. And then when I came to Australia, I wanted to do something different, and I always enjoyed the coaching side of my job. So then I set up a teaching business, and it started off teaching project management, because I just felt that people, weren't running projects well. And I remember, I had this vision initially of being a superstar and a guru in project management. And then people were talking about agile and lean. I was thinking, I've got to understand this. So I went on this journey to try and make sense of it. And then I realized, whoa, I'm missing lots of stuff. And then this is where I came across Mike, and I thought, wow, everything you were doing, Mike, really resonated with me. So I've been on this journey to try and help organizations sort of exactly like you've been saying, become more adaptive, enable agility, from top to bottom in organizations, and trying to find what are the big or the small levers that can have a big impact. And my latest thing, which we'll talk quite a bit about today, is what are the biggest obstacles that are stopping people? And I use this concept of unlearning. Like, to me, letting go of the past, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that all of us have got. And I'll really look forward to sort of digging into that. That's enough of me, though. Over to Deepak.
No, that's a really great start, and actually come back to a bit of that, I think. Deepak, your turn.
Yes, thanks, Mike, and good morning, everyone. I'm quite pleased to be here. Thanks for the invitation, for coming out. So just a little bit about me. As you probably can't tell from my accent, I'm South African born, of Indian ancestry. And I've been living in Melbourne for the last 12 years. I previously grew up and worked in South Africa before that, worked in the UK for a year, and then been working in Australia for the last 12 years. My background is I'm a mechanical engineer and project manager. I always wanted to be a mechanical engineer right from the time I was in high school. The project management thing kind of came about as a result of being a very young and cocky engineer one day. And I remember thinking to myself, surely the project manager can do a better job of what he's doing. And for my sins, one day, my engineering manager tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, you know what, why don't you go and help the project manager out? And I've been working in project management for 15 years as a result. So as a mechanical engineer, I actually started off life as an academic at a university. I was teaching fluid mechanics. You couldn't think of a more nerdier subject to teach.
I did a bit of that in maths, so yeah, I can relate
exactly,
to that.
Right? Very nerdy subject. I then went on to work in industry after my academic experience, filling engineering roles and then project management roles and then PMO roles. And I'm now kind of in a senior management role. I've worked primarily in the defense and energy industries. I've worked across a couple of interesting programs over my time. So nuclear power, aircraft propulsion, armored vehicles, and soldier systems. I've known Stephen since about 2013. In fact, when he just became a project management trainer, I was preparing to take the PMP exam. And so that's how Stephen and I first met. He was a trainer, I was a student. And we've collaborated on and off ever since on a few topics, including the unlearning program, which he now runs. I think I was one of the first to trial it with the organization that I work off, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. And we did that in 2020 during COVID when we were in lockdown. So not only was it Stephen's first time doing that, but he was doing it in a virtual environment. Yeah. As for me, so in Australia, I've worked in the defense industry, like I said, for 12 years. The organization I work for, DMTC, we specialize in running research and development programs on behalf of defense and national security customers. And we partner with a lot of industry and academic institutions here to run those programs. So on its own, we're a small organization. Right now, we're about 29 people, but we're running a portfolio that involves probably around 100 personnel that are sourced from a whole lot of organizations. So a big focus of what we do is collaborating and facilitating collaboration across organizational boundaries. And as Stephen mentioned, he works to try and help organizations, be better, be more agile. He does it with many organizations. I think I've sort of taken on that role internally. It's a bit of a passion of mine in the organization, which I work to try and change the conversations on a daily basis towards being more outcomes focused, more adaptive, not getting bogged down in process, not getting bogged down in the cynicism. So that's kind of that's sort of my passion in the industry at the moment. And
I can relate to both your journeys. I mean, I was that cocky engineer. I did one module of fluid mechanics. I studied maths at university. You know, and I thought I only the sharpest tool in the box. You know, and I thought I knew everything. And of course, as the more real life and the more real industry that you encounter, you realize just how little you know. And you realize just how much of succeeding is actually about people rather than the technical things. And you start to realize that some of these other jobs are actually really hard. And so hard that I wouldn't want to do them. I wouldn't want to be a salesperson, for example, but I understand why organizations have them. I've never wanted to be a project manager, I'll be perfectly honest with you. I actually much preferred being a techie. But I did rise through management. You know, I was an executive director at an investment bank. I've managed a global department. I know what an 8-figure budget looks like, all that kind of stuff. And I relate to what Stephen's saying as well. You know, when you encounter things like lean and agile, they're not just things to use. They're not just tools. They actually make you reinterpret the past a bit. And you think, oh, that's why that went wrong. Oh, that's why that went right.
Yeah.
You know, and you start to understand things differently. And then it seems every few years you learn something new, and it changes your thinking about it yet again. So I guess this takes us back to back to what you're bringing today, this unlearning stuff. So tell us what that's about, and put that into context for us first of all, and then, you know, when that's working at its best, when it's at its most, I'm putting words into your mouth now, but when you get that sort of real deep insight, you know, what's happening, what's that like, you know, and where does it take you?
Yeah. I suppose going back to my journey, Mike, of where I've sort of landed on this is, you know, and I like a lot of when I was going on this journey, and I remember some distinctive moments, like there was when I was going on the agile journey, I was asking some friends of mine to say, I want to learn from the best. Who's the best in the world at the time, you know, of you know, implementation consultants. And there was a guy called Eric Wilkie. And apparently he was one of the guys who at the very early days of the agile movement, he worked for Rally. He was one of these top guys. And he came to Melbourne. You know, Mike, yeah. And I remember sitting in this classroom with Eric, and it was a 2-day agile portfolio. It was a high level kind of thing. And I remember the first day my head was spinning. And I was thinking, because I couldn't disagree with what he was saying, but it didn't gel with what I was doing. And then the second day, I remember the penny dropped. And it was like, there was this feeling came over me. It's like, oh my God. And I had this horrible feeling that I'd just been wasting 5 years of my life because I'd had this view of, you know, what was most important. And I could see that fundamentally what had to shift in me was my thinking. And it was the mindset stuff. And it was like, oh my God. And then, so that was the thing. And I remember coming back and I designed, you know, because I could see the big need that was needed, you know, this kind of shift that was needed. And I went to, and I designed a course, which I call Agile and Lean Awareness. And I was working for one of the big banks here in Australia. And because I'd got a really good reputation, I said, oh, I've just designed this new course, you know, would you be interested in it? And they said, oh, yeah. And we ran a pilot. And before I know it, I was running it out across the whole of Enterprise and Change here at this big bank. And I was doing it, and all the feedback I was getting was amazing. And, oh, it's great. And then I'd meet people after this, and I'd reflect on it and say, well, how big an impact was this having? You know, and honestly, when I came back, I was saying it wasn't really having the impact I thought it should be having. And I kept asking this question, why? Why is it not really resonating? And I came back to two things for me. Was one, it was sort of a lack of understanding because the whole environment was so confusing and everybody couldn't figure out what's most important. And it's like, it was just so noisy. And then the other one was that we weren't tackling this mindset within the organization. We were still stuck in this old ways. And Barry O'Reilly wrote this book called Unlearn 2018. And I was always looking for a hook that could help sort of enable the conversations. And one of the things, I always ask people this question, I say, what's easier for you to do? Learn something new or let go of something old? And you sort of ask people, what's easier for you to do? And, you know, and to me, this thing, letting go of the old, to me, is just the biggest challenge for all of us because of the way we're naturally wired. And
can we go back to
go on.
that penny dropping moment?
Yeah.
No, I mean, you're wanting that to happen for other people, but what was happening for you? You know, what were you letting go of, and what do you think helped? What caused that penny finally to drop? You know, did you just wake up with the answer in the morning, or was there a process that you went through? How did that happen?
I think to me I'm curious, and I'm always trying to, like I said, connect the pieces and make sense out of things. And I feel like there was just that curiosity, and I suppose courage to be able to challenge my old thinking. Was, I think, that the reason why I was able to do it, because it was very confronting, and because I remember feeling sick. But you know, at that time, because I really did honestly think, like when I'd met Deepak, I was all about being, you know, one of the top trainer in Australian project management, and I'd invested lots of time in relationships and all that kind of stuff that I was doing. And I suddenly realized, oh my God, there's value in it. Oh, absolutely, but it wasn't where I needed to be in terms of doing it. So I think,
Are you able to say what was the thing you were most wrong about?
I think, like, if you take more
specific,
yeah, okay, so let's get specific. The biggest one was, you know, and everybody probably are very familiar with, you know, the Agile Manifesto, and, you know, one of the values there, we have people interactions over process and tools. And that to me was, yes, you know, what's your belief around what's most important?
Yes.
And if you look at traditional project management, process gives you consistency, repeatability, everything is about that best practice. And that one thing was, if you follow that chain and you realize that belief, you need to shift that belief to be what's most important.
Yes.
You know, and to me, a good process today mightn't be a good process.
That goes back to my introduction, doesn't it? You know, I said it's people relating to each other. And that really is the most important thing. But that doesn't mean that process isn't important either. You know, people still need to coordinate. You still need to organize around the right things and so on. It's actually finding that right balance between the two. I think it's one of the fundamental challenges of organizing. That's chapter 1 of adaptive organization, by the way. Organizing is all about relationships between things. I mean, not just relationships between people, but between, you know, what we do, why we do things, how we do them as well. But it takes, when you're so used to being taught tools and models and things, it takes a while to see things in that kind of view. You know, I think, Right. So let's fast forward the story a bit. So you know, where do you and Deepak, you know, encounter each other? You know, where do you find yourself doing this stuff together?
Yeah, well, this like Deepak said in the introduction, we've known each other for such a long time, and I remember, you know, when you're running a class, you know, you know there's the really smart people in the class, and Deepak, the questions and what he was asking me was always like, wow, this guy's an amazing guy, and we've always had these conversations sort of over the years. I'll let you speak, Deepak, but you know, and you know, and I suppose I feel like you've got the same kind of curiosity that I have, you know, that kind of sense of, you know, looking and discovering stuff. And I remember when I came across the unlearning stuff and introducing you to it, I think we initially ran we pulled Barry O'Reilly, who wrote the book, and we ran some sessions here in Melbourne. And we pulled some great people, and you were at it. So maybe I'll let you share, you know, from your side.
I think probably just a bit of just in terms of the build up to that. I think, like Stephen, I think I was going through sort of a similar journey, just in my mind, right? Having done the PMP, kind of working in project management, and then in terms of applying that in the industry that I'm in, on paper you're kind of doing all the right things, but for somehow just the outcomes that you're aspiring to are just not getting there. And this wasn't just in our organization. I mean, this is probably if anybody works in government services or any sort of government procurement, I think you'll see this top to bottom. I think it's very pronounced in the defense industry. So having experienced this, doing all the right things, not achieving the outcomes, and really starting to question, okay, why am I doing this? And then, as Stephen said, there was a lot of talk of agile frameworks, etc. So you go and do a bit of learning on that, and then you go back and you try and apply it. You try and do things, and it looks good. It starts off well, but then you're encountering the same things. You're doing the right things on paper, just not achieving the outcomes. And so I started to delve into like, why, and trying to observe what's happening in the organization. And one of the things I did observe is, I think you mentioned it, the sort of the why, what, how. And I sort of conceptualized it in, well, I mean, the why is kind of like the strategy, right? What you're trying to do. The what is the outcomes you're trying to achieve, but not always getting there. And the how is this, eventually it's the system of work that you're putting in place. And that how is an important aspect, because what sort of my observation, my feeling was that how, and this is more from the worker level, that how presents kind of a sense of comfort, sense of predictability. And once you're in that mode, you focused on the how, and you focused on the metric of the how, and you forgot the relationship with the outcomes.
It's one of these balances again, isn't it? We need coordination systems that really support the work that we're trying to do, and the way we express the work that needs to be done needs to be descriptive enough of what we want things to look like, the outcomes, but not so prescriptive that we actually deny people the opportunity for creative problem solving.
Exactly.
There's balances all over the show, isn't it? Or you can talk, if you're a complexity person, you can talk in terms of constraints. Do we have the right constraints that keep us out of trouble? So we're not overburdened, we don't have quality problems, we're not starved, those kind of things. That's sort of complexity way of describing coordination problems. And do we have constraints that nudge us in the right direction towards the spaces we're trying to open up, and so on? These need some quite fine touches, and it takes nuance, and also respect for people's autonomy and for teams' autonomy, and so on. This is deep stuff, hard stuff, isn't it?
It is exactly. And I can remember the bit.
Yeah.
Sorry. The bit
I was going to say, describe this when this is working, at its best. When have you seen it work in its best? What's the best that you can imagine? Let's just focus on that for a moment.
I can actually pull an example. I can't talk about the project specific, but in the particular scenario where you go through the motions, you've got the outcomes defined, and you go down into the detail of the how. But where it's working well, the observation is there's an energy there.
Yeah.
There's an energy in terms of people are motivated. When they encounter problems, you see them self-organizing around to solve those problems. And then there's a willingness to then share that information and communicate up, down, left, and right. So that connection then between the outcomes are maintained. And then those who are responsible for the outcomes are part of this conversation in terms of a willingness to rethink those outcomes in the face of new information.
Yes.
And so that's.
I'm smiling and nodding because this could have been me speaking. This is great.
But that's the only way I could describe it in the few experiences that I've had is there's just a different feeling in that team.
Yes.
Compared to other teams.
Yes. Yes. Oh, that's great. So what stops that? Why isn't it not like that all the time?
Why is it not like that all the time? So my observation.
Everywhere. Why is it not like that everywhere? What stops that? What gets in the way? Yeah.
I think there's a sense of people falling into the habits, the stronger habits. The scenarios where we've seen the energy and the energy is good have been start and I wouldn't call it start and stop. They've been specific cases even within an organization. A specific project, a specific initiative had a beginning, it had an end. And in that small context, it worked well. As soon as it starts to permeate back into the organization, those stronger behaviors, or stronger beliefs, or stronger habits that drive towards focusing on the process and the metrics, etc., tend to take over. And this is where I think the unlearn concept sort of, that's where the penny dropped for me.
Right.
It's like, why does it go, why do we go back to those habits? And this is where, as Stephen said, right, it's harder to unlearn those habits. It's good to experience something new, but until that's what you've experienced, that those new ways of working, those new ways of interacting, until they can become your predominant habits, you're going to fall back into your old habits.
Okay, so this is we've landed on the big issue. So so say some more about that, either of you, both of you.
Yeah, I think that whole thing of the default, and I suppose one of the things that I feel is really strong is that kind of building the awareness of people of how we're naturally wired. Because like Deepak says, we have a 100,000-year-old brain that's wired first and foremost for survival, and it's wired for efficiency. And most of the time, 95% of the time, we're doing things on autopilot without even realizing it. And sort of that awareness of how we're wired is, to me, is getting people to understand that and understand. I feel like that's just so key. And then
most of the time we need to work on autopilot, don't we? I mean, we would burn ourselves out otherwise. It's so how do you go from being on autopilot to not being?
I suppose, well, from my point of view, is you've got to and I use COVID as a great example. Like, we have this, as human beings, we have this incredible ability to evolve and adapt. But we've got to, if you're in a COVID world, you're forced to change, and you see how people can change really quickly and fast. And it's amazing, isn't it? How we do it. But if we don't have that, we have to build into ourselves that ability to constantly be willing to challenge our thinking and be able to disrupt ourselves. And there's a great quote by Barry O'Reilly. He said the truth about disruption is it doesn't apply to organizations, it applies to individuals. So at the deepest level, we've got to be willing to challenge our own thinking and be open to, and that's why I love everything you do, Mike, and asking questions like the deep question. That's a way of enabling that to happen. I feel
so it's great to wish for these things. How do we actually make it happen? How do we snap people out of autopilot? What are the opportunities? What are the situations in which people are actually deeply thinking about what they're doing and why and how?
Well, on this, I could probably share sort of my experience because after I encountered sort of the unlearn, I attended that series with Barry. I read the book. I looked at the framework. I thought, this is something really interesting. And I immediately fell into that old habit of thinking, this is something we could probably implement and scale in our organization. Great. So we ran the course. We did it in a virtual sense. It received a lukewarm reception. And then all my aspirations were immediately shattered. So I thought, well, here's a great framework that we can systematically challenge how we think. Maybe we can integrate this into the way we work. And it died before it even started. But interestingly,
like a lot of change initiatives do.
A lot of change initiatives do. But from those workshops that we ran, something interesting happened also. There were a couple of key individuals who took away some of the thinking here. And so while we did not progress with scaling it across the organization, the seeds were planted in the minds of a few individuals. And what had happened thereafter is it influenced their thinking and influenced the way they approached conversations in the workplace. So instead of having a structure that challenged people to, or that drove people to challenge their assumptions, their mindsets, their perceptions behind the actions that they're taking, we found we could, these few individuals, by having conversations about that in the fly of doing work, began to prompt people to think about it. So it wasn't necessarily systematic, but it became systematic for these few individuals. But the net effect starts to change the conversation. So you create these opportunities at specific points in the flow of work, almost as a bit of a check, just to pause and think. Okay, why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve here? It started off being fairly simple things like that, but then that starts to permeate, and then you see other stuff.
How often were these things happening?
Um, Initially, they were, I'd say, probably scattered in a few project meetings, etc. But then slowly you see it start to become more systematic. So in the regular team catch-ups, in the regular organizational level catch-ups, feedback is given and questions are asked that kind of, make you pause and think about
What were
where
we
we
thinking?
thought we were going, where we thought we were going to go next. Should we actually
Yeah.
continue on that line?
Yeah.
Or should we at least pause and reflect?
Yes.
And just take stock. Are we still heading for the outcomes that we wanted to head on, or are we getting dragged into just the system of work and the metrics and the KPIs that we're chasing because it's on paper?
Yes. Yes. Good.
And can I add to that? Because one of the things, like following on from what Deepak was saying, as I've been doing these more programs, is that exactly that. If you want something like this to happen, the system of work is so key. You've got to build in a rhythm and a cadence for how you're doing this, because otherwise it's just not going to happen, because we'll go back to default back to our normal way. And what I've been doing in the latest program that I've been running with an organization is we've put in a very simple thing where we've just get people to share unlearning moments of where they have, had a belief about something and it's suddenly blown up. And especially for leaders to share this with their teams and create a safe environment where people are willing and open to share this. And this is having a really significant effect, I'm finding now in clients, where we're actually building that into the rhythm of how they're operating. And just that one thing of making it open and available for people to share these kind of things. And I look at it as like a leading measure for innovation. It's like how, when you look at the rate of change that's happening in the environment now, if you're not unlearning and relearning, stuff, then, and I always, there's a rule of thumb I use for myself, which I heard one time, says, if you're not a little bit embarrassed by who you were this time last year, then you're not learning enough, and unlearning and relearning enough. And to me, that's the nature of the world. Yeah, I feel.
Yes, yeah, that's actually another balance there, isn't there? There's does our sense of identity, does it so dominate our thinking that we won't get out of our comfort zone? Do we, we're too clear about who we are and how we do things? When anyone has a good idea, is our instant reaction, that's not who we are? If when you have that problem, then it's very hard to change things.
Yeah, well, and Dan, I think you've hit a really important point there, Mike, because again, when you look at, and again, one of the questions I've always asked myself is why, especially as the more senior leadership level, why is it so hard to shift the beliefs? And I think a lot of it is that their identity is linked to their belief. And that is a really difficult that connection.
Yeah.
And there's a great book, I don't know if people have read it on the call, which I give out to all of my things. It's a book which is a follow-on to Who Moved My Cheese, called Out of the Maze. And there's a great line in it where it's a reframe where he says, you are not your beliefs, you're the person who chooses your beliefs. And I just think that, helping people to step away from that is so important.
Yes, I guess as people rise through organizations, they're going to carry on doing the things that help them be successful. But now you're faced with a new set of challenges, and those old tools probably not quite so useful. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Mike, there's a certain there's a danger that people don't perceive, right? They'll keep doing the things that worked for them until it doesn't. And as you move more senior in the organization, when it doesn't, it affects a lot of people.
Yes. And that can have an effect at organizational scale as well. I mean, in a changing environment, what worked for the organization as a whole 5 years ago might not be working now. When there's as Stephen was saying, there's that pre-COVID and post-COVID, very, very different. But also, you might be very dependent on a product that was very successful 5 years ago, but now looks old and tired.
Yeah.
And it's recognizing when is the time to be striking down some new paths. That's hard. And I think one thing I like about this conversation, I think we've all been quite empathetic to the people involved. Blaming people doesn't help. It's actually recognizing from our own experience how hard some of this stuff can be is part of it. And yes, hard, not just because it's technically difficult, or it involves some deep thinking, but because, you know, actually admitting that to yourself that something was wrong can, you know, that can be hard. I mean, going back to that, your penny dropping experience, Stephen. Yeah, it sounds like you didn't entirely enjoy that experience.
No, I didn't. It was very confronting. But it's, yeah, and I think, yeah, no, it's I just, because like you say, Mike, you know, when you look at the world, the reality of the world we're living in now, all of us, like it is phenomenal. Like I'm sure everybody's familiar with ChatGPT. You know, in front of our eyes, things are changing like really fast. And I didn't think this sort of generic AI stuff would really have such an impact so quickly. And that's sort of belief that I've had to unlearn now, because you can see how fast this is happening now. So if we don't all build that sort of capability to unlearn and relearn, that, you know, going into the future, we're in really dangerous territory. And that now is like a foundational, you know, like, you know, Nassim Taleb talks about anti-fragile. How do you build anti-fragile into all of us? And to me, that ability to unlearn and relearn is the core. And I think no matter where you are in the organization, it's so key, because the knowledge and skills are just, you know, can become outdated so quickly and so fast now.
Can I ask a slightly leading question, maybe a very leading question? But it comes back to some stuff that we've all alluded to. You know, sustaining change is really hard, and you need those cadences, as Stephen has said. You need those moments of learning, as both of you have said. One ingredient I think is very often missing is that expectation that when we go to the next meeting, we will have some learning to share. You know, we'll have some progress to share, some learning to share. Does that thought resonate with you? And how, if so, how do you create that expectation? How has that worked for you?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Mike. Because one of the things that I've been trying to work on as I've been trying to evolve these kind of unlearning programs is, because when I look at organizations, I'm looking at each of the different functional areas like finance and procurement and legal. And I'm seeing that, you know, there's a lot of unlearning and relearning that's needed to happen in there. And I run these programs and I teach people at a high level the concept. But then what I feel is missing is you've got to help them on the journey, and you've got to introduce them to who's, like in finance, who's leading the way in terms of new thinking. And you introduce them to these areas, and then you give them the challenge to say, okay, now, you know, we're going to have on this cadence that we're coming back, we want somebody from finance to share an unlearning moment that they've had. And then that person doing that, you know, it's just has such an impact. But you've got to help them, because it's very hard for them to sort of see, if that makes sense. That's the way I see it.
So I take a slightly different view on this. So I think once you've got the cadences and stuff in place, and the interactions and the connections between outcomes and outputs, etc., those structures become structures for their own purpose. And generally, you find that the innovation and the great ideas and the solutions to problems don't tend to follow those patterns. They tend to follow the social interactions, or I'd say they tend to follow the network of interactions happening within the business. They don't follow the cadence. And so hence, and even having a structured cadence for people to bring learnings or unlearnings to, as you said, Mike, what if somebody doesn't have anything to bring? Well, what if nobody has anything to bring to that at that particular point in time? But
I think actually, I think you're both right. I think you're both right. This is chapter 4 of adaptive organization. Now you do need those rhythms. You do need those opportunities, but also the network is super important as well. And part of adaptability is actually new structures creating. You know, it's a self-organization at every scale, and you need to understand your networks. You need to be trust building across your networks. You need to be reconciling your understanding of what needs to be done, your strategy for you and your area, with what other people are planning for their areas, and so on. That's like the lifeblood of change in organizations. It's the lifeblood sharing intelligence and the organization understanding what's happening outside and how it needs to respond to it. You know, it's not formal versus informal, it's the two feeding off each other. And yeah, and again, it's coming back to people interacting with each other, isn't it? Or we're back to that first manifesto value again. You know, process is necessary, but it takes you only so far, and you've got to understand how to balance off the formal versus the informal, and leave room for some creativity, leave room for some innovation, and so on.
And safety, Mike. Safety.
Yes,
There needs
absolutely.
to be safety.
Yes.
That psychological safety is fundamental. So
Yes.
absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I asked you what stops that, what gets in the way, and you were free to answer that question in your own way. You know, I know organizations where it's actually not okay to talk about obstacles, you know, that sort of toxic positivity and all that kind of stuff. You know, we're just going for the goal, and nothing's going to get in our way, and so on. That is so unhelpful. That's actually setting people up for failure, and I hate it. I'm just aware of the time. It's 20 past. So maybe a closing thought from each of you, then we'll throw it open for questions. Questions to the two of you first. If there are broader questions about agenda shift and leading with outcomes that anyone wants to ask afterwards, feel free as well. So I'll go to Deepak first. Closing thought from you.
Closing thought. Yeah, I think one of the areas that I'm currently kind of focused on now is, as you mentioned, Mike, it's that interaction between the informal network in organizations and the formal structures, and how to get those two, how to get information to flow more freely between those two. And I'll probably, one of the things I'm kind of trying to drive at the moment is how do we build the competence and the safety within an organization that people feel comfortable to self-organize around an idea at the time that they have the idea, even if it's out of sync with it, and then bring it back into the cadence once they're able to consult and to form that idea properly. So that's probably just my parting thought. I don't know how this will work, how this will play out. We'll see in the future.
Good. And can I mention a quick plug for the meetup I'm speaking at tomorrow? We'll be talking about some of those things tomorrow. Yeah. Every piece of work is an opportunity for self-organization, isn't it? But how much you need to invest in it is going to vary from piece to piece as well. Stephen.
Yeah, I think, like I've just sort of said nearly at the end there, my thing is just, you know, helping people to see the importance of, you know, creating that safety and getting people to, you know, openly, you know, go on this journey to start sharing unlearning moments, be vulnerable and do that. And like you say, every organization I work with, they've got all these super smart people, and it's a matter of just trying to, like that network effect, get people working together and sharing that, because there's a significant journey organizations have to go on if they want to build, like you say, Mike, these adaptive organizations. You know, we've got these old world thinking that's embedded across organizations, and if we can't unlock this kind of conversations across all these different functional areas, then we're kidding ourselves, because all they're going to do is that those areas are just going to be like anchors that will pull us back into the past. And it's just, we're kidding ourselves. You go forward in one way, and then it's just going to pull you back. Yeah, that's mine.
Good. Well, it's been fantastic having you. Just while we finish up, if you have questions, you can turn your cameras on now. If you want to ask a question, just to the camera, or you can ask a question in chat, and we'll take them that way. I'll moderate them that way. Just while you're thinking about your questions, just a reminder, I will, for all the people that have registered for this webinar, I will send an email with the links about the events and so on coming up. For the sake of the video, here are some of the main links now. I should include on that one, agendashift.com/events. That's where all the upcoming events are. And I hope to see you at the next couple of webinars, April. How do we keep outcomes? How do we keep bringing outcomes to the foreground as we are pursuing strategy? And for May, hopefully with a special guest who will announce soon, where else should we be developing and pursuing strategy, that fractal engagement thing. So questions, let me unshare my screen. Questions for Stephen and Deepak. We got one from Timo, actually. Any tips for reducing the amount of meetings? It's a good one. And a thank you there from Nadia as well. Inspiring.
Well, I think that particular topic, the amount of meetings, perhaps it's an opportunity to experiment with, just try and experiment, drop a few meetings and just see what happens in the organization. Or just, shake up a few meetings, change it from being a 1 hour meeting to a 5-minute meeting or something like that. Actually, if you want to do a 5-minute meeting, try and do a plank meeting where everybody tries to do a plank. And I guarantee you'll keep your meeting down to 2 minutes.
I love that, Deepak.
Well, 30 seconds in my case. So I suppose one thing is just to make sure you don't cancel all the meetings where you're going to share the what you learned during that experiment. How about how about say at the next meeting we're going to be sharing what we learned by cancelling some meetings. Everyone will be ready to share their unlearning and their learning from that. Yeah. Stephen, have you any experience reducing meetings or making meetings more efficient or anything about meetings?
Yeah, like I just so much wasted time and effort you see in meetings, and people, yeah, like to me, I suppose there's a great guy who I know quite well who works for Atlassian, and he had this he was off for a while, and he basically did this thing where he cancelled every meeting in his diary, and he basically went to everybody, said, you have to come back and justify why you want me at that meeting. What value am I going to add for what I'm doing? And he ended up freeing like 33% of his calendar based on that. And I just think you've got to be really, hard. If you're not just refusing to go to meetings, if it's not clear about, what the role you're playing, the value that you can bring, and just, I don't know, I find for myself that just, the last thing I want to do is waste my time.
Yeah.
So being hard and doing that or pushing back.
I'm personally I'm not anti-meeting, to an extent. Meetings are the lifeblood of organizations, but also, again, it's a balance thing. You need to get some work done. And when I was in corporate life with a calendar exposed to 20,000 people, the way I did it was to block time out in my calendar. I made sure there were significant chunks of time every day where I could get done the things I wanted to have done. Some of that was still meetings, it was informal meetings with people around me. But yeah, to have an hour of your day taken out by something that's of not great value to anybody is very, very wasteful. Got to treat people's time as precious. Any more questions? Oh, any public resource on your unlearning stuff? That's from Christoph.
Yeah, Christoph, if you go onto my website, there's we have some videos there, and there's some longer sessions that I've done that might be worthwhile watching, which sort of we go through the whole kind of the unlearning message and the journey. And there's canvases that we've developed, unlearning canvases that you can actually use and apply to try to do this in a more systematic kind of way. So
Stephen, if you can email me those right after this call, then I will include them in my mail out to everybody. Yeah,
will do. Okay, will do, Mike. Yeah, thanks.
Yes. Yeah, good. I've had a question about this stuff in different countries as well. France in particular, but I guess if anyone knows of people doing things like this in their locality, then let me know, and I'll make sure that gets shared. But this has been an absolute pleasure. You're coming you're coming at things from a different direction to me, but we seem to be arriving at some very similar conclusions. I mean, some of what Deepak describes, it could almost have been me describing it, even though I'm coming from quite a different place. So I'm coming at things from outcomes before solutions. That's been as I said in the introduction, the question that's driven us for the last seven years now. And it's done us very well, but it does very quickly take you to learning, and you've come to somewhere similar. And I think we're all three of us having some quite similar thoughts about organization as well, how organizations work and what doesn't work. And think, well, why doesn't it work so often? I mean, Agenda Shift really was about, can we get away from that old model of, solution first change, which we all know is horrible. And your own stories said how prone it is to failure. How can we find some better ways of doing it? Ask some better questions. And sometimes it's just a matter of asking those questions again and again and again until we start to hear some more interesting answers, isn't it? Yeah. So 29 minutes past. I think it's probably time to stop the recording. But it's been great to have you, and thank you once again to Stephen and Deepak. And I'll send the email out later today, and the video will be up on YouTube in due course. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.